Good morning, folks, and welcome back to our seventh unit of AP Biology. We got this one and one more to go before the test, guys. So good job on getting this far. You are three quarters done, one quarter only left to go. Today we're going to cover part one on natural selection and specifically 7.1, which is kind of the general introduction to natural selection, the real basics on what it is, and taking really a look at it through the historical lens of Darwin and how he developed this theory early on. And then we will start getting more in depth into it and some of the nuances that we've, of Darwin's theory itself, but then the things that have been added to it and tweaked on it in the 150 years since he first published on the origin of species. So let us begin. We're going to do just kind of an overview in history right here, which is 7.1. Before, for much of human history, we didn't think that things really had changed that much. Stuff seemed fairly static to most individuals throughout most of human history. There wasn't a lot of change. But as we're getting into the Renaissance and the early industrial age and the Age of Enlightenment, humans are starting to look at the world a little bit differently. We're starting to see things through a different lens. We're starting to take a scientific view of things. One of the things we were seeing was fossils were being discovered and recognized for what they were, that they were the remains of things that used to exist on this planet. Okay, and that laid a lot of the groundwork for Darwin's ideas and a lot of folks working on something similar back then. Just so that you're clear what a fossil is. So let's say you've got an ocean basin here with some sediment coming in from a river. Something dies, winds up in the layer of sediment on the bottom, gets covered up by successive layers of sediment. Maybe some new living things fall in there and a higher layer of sediment, and they'll get covered up. And over time, with that pressure and time and the right set of circumstances, you can generate a fossil whereby the organic material of the original creature is replaced by minerals and basically forms a new rock in the shape of the organic mineral that was there. And those are fossils. And fossils, we can get their relative ages by what layer of sediment they're in, because the lowest layer of sediment was the first one that was laid down. And as you go higher up through the strata, you get to younger and younger layers, and thus the fossils found in them should be relatively younger than the ones found deeper. So we can see some of how the fossils differed in an area over time and how there was change in what was living in an area over time. Okay. And James Hutton and Charles Lyell perceived that changes in the Earth's surface can result from slow, continuous actions still operating today and at the same rate. A prime example would be, the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon, right? If anybody's ever had the chance to go to the Grand Canyon or the American Southwest and see some of the Canyonland stuff, you can see all the different strata, all the different layers of rock formed over millions of years that were built up, and then the Colorado River started to carve through those and dig deeper and deeper every year. Maybe it's only half a centimeter a year, but a half a centimeter a year times a few million years, you can get pretty doggone deep. And so the geologists were able to measure that and extrapolate that and figure out that, in order to carve a canyon this deep, this river must have been flowing here for, 10 million years or something. I don't know the exact numbers on the Grand Canyon, but for a very long time. And they could calculate how fast mountains were rising and things of that nature. And from that, they were able to figure out that the Earth was way older than we thought. We used to think that the Earth was around 6,000 years old. But then some of these things, now they're getting calculations of the Earth being tens of millions, hundreds of millions years old. Now we know that it's about 4.5 million years old because we got more modern technology. We're able to measure some other things with, radioisotopes and rock formations and things of that nature. But all this was coming about before Darwin. This is why the theory of evolution didn't come up and wasn't. People may have thought something similar before Darwin, but these background pieces needed to be in place for evolution to happen. The fact that the Earth was really old and that the Earth has changed over time were kind of some of those prerequisites to really being able to think of evolution in the terms that we think of it today. Now, Darwin wasn't the only one wondering, okay, why do we have all this diversity of life on this planet? But there's some similarities, right? There's a lot of things that look very similar. Different species of deer, for instance, different species of squirrel, if you're in North America or whatever. Um, and we had fossils that look very similar to what we have today, but they're a little bit different. And then we have fossils that don't look like anything we've got today. And trying to explain this diversity of life on the planet and the differences in life on the planet. Um, and another thing that some folks, like this gentleman named Lamarck, saw was that species tended to be pretty well adapted to their environment. They seem to fit their environment well. Okay. Um, so trying to bring all these things together and come up with a theory and explanation of how this happened and why this happened was something a lot of folks were working on back then. Lamarck's idea was, and you don't need to memorize Lamarck's idea, I don't believe, for AP biology, but it's a good counterpoint to Darwin's. Was the mechanism of speciation, species evolving through the use and disuse of body parts, and the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So, use and disuse. Think of that like muscle building, right? If you work out a lot, you're going to get bigger muscles. If you don't and you just sit around, your muscles are going to get smaller. Okay, and then we would call those acquired characteristics, that you have big muscles or small muscles. All right, and then he would speculate that you would be able to pass it on to your kids, and your kids would inherit those required traits. So if you were a sedentary individual all your life, you would have kids with small muscles. If you lifted weights a lot when you had kids, you would have kids who had big muscles. So my kids should have come out really strong because at the time I had them, I was still lifting and I could bench press nearly 400 pounds at that point. But my kids didn't come out looking like little Arnie Schwarzeneggers. They came out like normal kids. A prime example he always used was giraffes, right? So giraffes, these little creatures down here, notice the shorter necks, slightly longer necks, and really long necks. His hypothesis would have supported the fact that over the lifetime, giraffes were eating from the leaves of the trees, and only the tallest giraffes could get to the leaves. So these giraffes, as they ate the lower leaves, they had to stretch a little bit higher and a little bit higher, and as they're stretching and stretching, their neck would get a little bit longer and a little bit longer over the course of their lifetimes, and that they would be able to then pass on that longer neck to their kids, so that all their kids would be born with necks that were already long. How does that fit in with what we know about genetics today? It doesn't, right? But they didn't have that understanding of genetics and DNA at that point in time. So, today we know that there's no way for that to happen. There's no way for something I do during my lifetime to change the DNA in my gametes in that specific of a way. Okay, saying that, oh, I've made big muscles, so I'm going to change the genes in my DNA that pertain to muscle building so that now my kids will have big muscles. Doesn't happen. Okay, there's no mechanism for that connection between out here and what happens in the DNA of the gametes in a person or an animal or whatever. Okay, so we know that's bunk. Okay, so that's kind of some of the other theories that were out there that were getting some traction at the time. Now let's take a look at Darwin himself. Here's the cool thing. Darwin was hired to be a naturalist on the HMS Beagle as it did a circuit around the world. And his job was to collect specimens of the flora and fauna, the animals and plants, all around the world, and catalog them and bring back samples and note the different environments and bring that all back to England. Okay, this was pretty unique. I don't know if there was any other naturalist before Darwin who had the opportunity to do this. Okay, the folks working, in academia back in Europe or wherever around the world, they had what was in their local area and the few odds and ends of stories they got, or odds and ends of curiosities that sailors would bring back from their voyages. Nobody had actually gotten to see that stuff and pay detailed attention to everything they were seeing all around the world in all these different parts of the world. And that afforded Darwin a unique view of life on this planet. And he observed a couple of key things, and we'll get into a little bit more, but among other things, he observed that fossils resembled living species from the same region. So if you had different living things in South America than you do in Europe, and the things in South America looked a lot more like the fossils that you found in South America, and the things in Europe looked a lot more like the fossils you found in Europe. Maybe not exactly the same, but there were similarities. So we noticed the similarities going backwards in time in a particular location. The other thing he noticed was the similarities in geographic proximity. Okay, so if you had a group of species like birds here, they looked a lot more like the birds here than they did like the birds in England. Even if the birds here were in a climate like in England, and the birds here were just a little bit further inland and a little further north in South America, say in the jungle. These jungle birds and these temperate birds looked a lot more similar than these temperate birds did to other birds from a temperate region in England. So there was some connection geographically. Okay, so one, they were adapted to their environment, but they showed similarities to things that were in completely different environment, but happened to be close. So, and then he was influenced by, he had that background of the fact that the Earth was way older than 6,000 years old, and that geologic processes happen slowly over time. And he was able to kind of connect those two ideas, these changes he was seeing in the fossil record and the similarities and differences he was seeing in the different species around the world. And he was able to connect those. And his prime examples he really found were on the Galapagos Islands, because on the Galapagos Islands, which were a small chain of islands, volcanic islands off the coast of South America in the Pacific, and they're volcanic. So when they first formed, there was no life there. Okay, that was undisputed. And the life on those islands looked very similar to the life on the nearest coastal areas of South America, but it was different. They were not the same species. So he didn't see, oh, this species, wound up out here on a raft of logs or something, or flew out here and got stranded on the islands, and now they're here. No, they were similar to the mainland species, but they weren't the same species. They were different species. Not only were they different species, but here's a little map of the Galapagos and his voyage, but not only were they different on the islands than they were over here, okay, in South America, they were even different on the different islands. So they looked very similar, but they were different species on different islands. And this was fascinating too. He was trying to figure out, okay, how could this happen? How could you get, one, life on these islands that wasn't there before, so it came in from South America. You could see that pretty clearly because it's very similar to South American life, but then it wasn't the same. It wasn't exactly the same. How can you explain these differences? And those differences tended to seem to be well fit for this new island environment. That was a slightly different environment than what he had in South America. So they were well adapted to their environment. They had these species obviously changed over time, and we got new species on the island that we didn't see anywhere else, and different species on these different islands even. So he had some tricky things to try to explain, figure out how could this happen. Okay, and so he was focused on this adaptation. How did these critters, who obviously came from South America, and now they have adapted to be well suited to this new island? Okay. So Darwin perceived adaptation to the environment and the origin of new species as close related processes. So you can see that these things were well fit to their environments, and you can see that we had new species that were well fit to their environments. Like here's a bunch of different finches that Darwin saw. Here you can see they're all finches. They all probably arose from, we now know, from the same group of finches to come up to the island originally. But we've got ones whose beaks are designed for cactus eating, for grabbing insects, and big chunky ones for eating seeds. And so he was really focused on how could this happen? How could you get one species then become, in this case, 3, or I think it's even more, different species on the Galapagos Islands? And it was speciation and adaptation to the environment. So he had 3 broad observations that he wanted to coalesce into a theory. Okay, one, the unity of life, how similar life was all around the world. He didn't know about the DNA similarities and those kind of things, but you could see some similar adaptations to similar environments. You could see things had 4 legs, or 4, or 2 legs and 2 wings. You could see, furry things in different areas and feathered things in different areas and stuff like that. At the same time, you saw a wide diversity of life. There were so many different types of life all over the globe that did show similarities and other things, but were different. And the third thing he saw was that match between the organisms and their environment. Okay, they were well suited to their environment, which is the same thing Lamarck saw. But Darwin wanted to come up with something different than Lamarck had. Lamarck's didn't make sense to him, as we know it does make sense to us. So how could you explain that close match between the environment and the species? Okay, and Darwin came up with his concept of descent with modification. Okay, which is fancy, the words he came up with for what we now call evolution. Okay, the phrase refers to the view that all organisms are related through the descent from an ancestor that lived in the remote past. So you have a common ancestor, and so you descend from that ancestor, just like you descended from your grandparents. But there are modifications, there are differences in those organisms over time from their ancestors. That's the modification. So you're descended from them, but you are different. That's the modification. Okay. Darwin noted that humans have modified other species by selecting and breeding individuals with desired traits. We call this artificial selection. Okay, humans, we kind of take the place of the environment, right? Take a look at down here. We've got some wild mustard in the brassica family, and from that original plant, farmers over 10,000 years have been able to grow kohlrabi, broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, all sorts of Brussels sprouts, I think, all came from that original plant. And this was by us choosing the offspring that we let mate. So we found some offspring that had the traits we wanted. Ooh, these ones have a little bit bigger edible parts than those ones. So if we're going to plant some seeds, let's plant the seeds from the ones that have bigger parts than the ones that have smaller parts. That just makes more sense, right? If you put in the same amount of work, if we can get twice the yield, for the same amount of work, let's do that. And then they breed those plants. They say, oh, let's pollinate this plant with that plant so that their offspring are more likely to have what we want. We can see that in dogs, right? They all probably descended from some common ancestor of a wolf. And in different areas of the world, breeding wolves, you'd select wolves that, came in and were more socially friendly to humans, were better able to work with humans, and you didn't keep around the ones that were a little bit more ornery or didn't want to share their food. Those ones you chased off and away from your camp, and eventually by keeping those dogs, those wolves near you that you could get along with, and then even going further than that and only breeding the dogs that had the traits you wanted, we got all sorts of different dogs. Holy cow, the different breeds of dogs. And that's all from selective breeding. You can see it here in pugs, just how much smaller they have gotten in like 130 years in this picture. This is, farming. How do we go from tomatoes all being this size to tomatoes like that? Or potatoes like this to potatoes like that? Okay. That's all due to selective breeding. We only breed those with the traits we want, and we don't breed those with the traits we don't. So humans are deciding who gets to breed and who gets to pass on their genes to the next generation. Okay. Natural selection is very much similar, but instead of humans deciding, nature decides who gets to breed by killing you off if you can't survive. And if you survive, okay, you survive, now you can breed. If you can find a mate, you can breed. Okay. So Darwin drew two inferences from two observations. So here are the two observations he made. Members of a population often vary in their inherited traits. So no population is universal. You look at these ladybugs. Every single one of them's got slightly different colors, slightly different sizes, different spots. You look at humans. Just if you're happen to be in the class next time or in a large group of people, notice none of us are the same. Some of us are faster, some are slower, some are taller, some are shorter. Some have bigger bony frames, some have slighter frames. Some are, better at one task than another. Some are able to digest lactose and some aren't able to digest lactose. We're all different, okay? And so that was an important characteristic, realizing that in every population, there is a wide variety of traits. They're not all identical. Okay. The second observation he made is that all species can produce more offspring than the environment can support, and many of these offspring fail to survive and reproduce. So here we can see a puffball, right? Giant puffball, all these little spores could grow into new puffballs. Most of them don't. If they all did, the Earth would be covered with puffballs. Okay, they don't. Most of them don't survive. That's why salmon lay thousands of eggs, but maybe a few dozen survive. All the other ones don't. So, they survive long enough to reproduce. In nature, a good chunk of your babies don't make it. Okay, and even for humans, for most of our existence, a good chunk of our offspring didn't make it. That's why average life expectancy was so low back in the day. It wasn't necessarily because you died in your 20s more often. The average was mostly held down from infant and young child mortality. So they died before they were able to reproduce. Okay. So those are two important observations that he made about nature just in general around him happening right now. So you've got those observations about the changes, the observations about how things are well adapted to their environment, that they're different now than they were in the past, all that stuff. And you add on top of that, within a given population, there's variation, and that there's always more offspring than the environment can support in just about every case. Then he was able to make two inferences from that. Inference one, individuals who inherited traits gave them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing. It's not just survival. You got to pass on your genes. He didn't know the word genes at the time, but if you had a higher chance of surviving and reproducing in a given environment, those individuals will tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. Just makes sense. If you die before you can reproduce, or you're not able to find a mate, you're not going to pass on your genes. This unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to the accumulation of favorable traits in a population over generations. So in any given generation, you may not notice much of a difference. Oh, we've got maybe in a population of 10,000, maybe we got an extra 5 folks who are a little faster and 5 fewer folks who are a little slower because the slower ones got eaten by lions, right? But generation after generation, those who are a little faster are more likely to escape the lions than those who are a little slower. So those who are a little faster are more likely to be able to live long enough to reproduce and pass on their genes for fastness to their kids, where those who are too slow don't. So over time, if they're equal proportions that are fast and slow, over time, we'll get fewer slow genes in the environment and more fast genes. And I can't make my hands go farther apart, but if it was equal, and this was the midpoint, we get fewer and fewer slow and thus more and more fast until the entire population just has those faster genes. Okay. If some heritable traits are advantageous, these will accumulate in the population over time, and this will increase the frequencies of individuals with those traits. That's what I just said. And that process explains the match between organisms and their environment. Okay. The traits that stick around are the ones that help you survive and reproduce in that environment. So, natural selection, a brief summary. Individuals with certain heritable traits survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. Makes sense. And this is heritable traits, right? Heritable traits survive and reproduce at a higher rate than other individuals. Natural selection increases the match between the organisms, or more specifically their traits, and their environment over time, because nature is selecting who is going to survive and or be able to reproduce. Okay? So that means the traits over enough time, enough generations, will get closer and closer and better matched to that particular environment. Great. So that means everything should get to be perfectly matched with their environment, right? Well, not exactly. The other thing Darwin noticed, and the geologist has noticed, is that the environment changes. So if the environment changes over time, natural selection may result in adaptation to these new conditions and may give rise to new species. The reason life is not static and it changes over time is because the environment changes over time. There's always change, which means there's always going to be some form of evolution. And that will do it for the 7.1, the introduction. If you're doing this on your own, at this point, you should hop into AP Classroom and do the 7.1 topic questions. If you haven't done so yet, watch those daily videos on 7.1 just to give you a little more context and a different view than what I said here. But if you got any questions, come and talk to me and I'll help you out. Thanks. Bye.